Hello, my name is Henry, and I'm one of the life coaches at Rewire Life Coaching. And I want to talk to you for a few minutes on the subject of managing stress. We're all experiencing stress at this difficult time, but we want stress to be a visitor rather than a resident. I hope you find this talk helpful. I'm going to look at what stress is, the effect it has on our bodies, and what we can do to reduce the stress in our lives. Stress is a normal physiological response to danger, and we know what that feels like when we're dealing with an angry dog or some other sort of danger. When we're confronted with an emergency, our brain is triggered to make us ready for fight or flight. It's rather like the emergency cord on a train being pulled. The brain sends messages to other parts of the body to make us ready to deal with the problem. Adrenaline and cortisol are then released into the body to help speed oxygen and glucose around the blood system to the bigger muscles in our bodies, to our hearts, to our lungs, to our legs, to our brains. This is a normal physiological response to danger, and it's a good response. So if dealing with the stress of an angry dog or another sort of emergency is producing good stress, what makes other stress so unhelpful to us? Well, the thing is, we respond to psychological or emotional stress in the same way that we do to physical danger. And we can live with this type of stress for a long time. You see, stress is rather like a guitar string. It requires tension and some stress in order to be able to play and operate properly. But with too much, it will eventually snap. So as we're experiencing such a lot of tension at this time, it's helpful to understand the effect that stress has on our bodies. You see, at times of stress, the body diverts blood from the less essential organs to the more essential organs. For example, from our skin, from our salivary glands, from our digestive systems, to our lungs and to our heart. This is to help us to effectively deal with the emergency. And it's during these times that we might experience some of the following symptoms: an increase in our heart rate, an increased incidence in going to the loo, tightness across our shoulders, abdominal discomfort, difficulty getting to sleep. If this continues over a prolonged period of time, it can have a detrimental impact upon us, both physically and psychologically, and can lead on to anxiety, depression, mood swings, to outbursts of anger, memory loss, and the inability to concentrate and focus on task. These things are sometimes very difficult to do. All of these symptoms are triggered by situations that we would regard as being dangerous or an emergency. Adrenaline and cortisol are released to help handle the problem, but they themselves can eventually become the problem, because actually we need to see a reduction in the levels of cortisol and adrenaline in our bodies. So if we need to reduce these two hormones, we need to look at how they're released. You might be surprised to know that adrenaline and cortisol are released because of what we say to ourselves, our self-talk, the things that we speak to ourselves about in our head. This is a key factor in causing adrenaline and cortisol to be released. Did you know that we speak at the rate of around 60 words a minute? But did you know that we speak internally at the rate of around 1,300 words a minute? I think it would be useful to be aware of our self-talk so that we know what's going on in our internal world, don't you? Self-talk causes us to ask, what if, and leads us to worry. It then triggers our threat response. And this can actually be categorized into several types. The first is the worrier. This self-talk is always anticipating the worst. They go off into the future and imagining disaster, and always are asking the question, what if? Secondly, there's the retrospective. This type of self-talk is always living in the past, saying if only, and it's an extremely tiring form of self-talk. Then there's the critic, who's always saying, I'm a failure, I just can't do it right. Then there's the victim, who tell themselves how hopeless and helpless they are. They're just useless. Well, in this present climate, it's very easy to have this type of self-talk because we can feel so powerless. Then there's the perfectionist. This type of self-talk is saying, I ought, I must, I should. And they always feel bad because they feel they can't do well enough. So, how do we reduce the levels of adrenaline and cortisol in our bodies to ensure that we improve our emotional health and well-being? Well, here are a few simple tips. The first is to recognize the power of your self-talk. It's going on all the time. We're speaking to ourselves all the time about everything that we see and hear. There's a commentary that's going on in our heads. So if we can recognize what's going on, we might be able to do something about it. Then the ability to be able to catch yourself in the act. That's in the act of thinking. Think about what you're thinking about. Next time you're stressed, ask yourself the question, what am I saying to myself? You may be having a heated discussion with someone in your family. If you're able, it's worthwhile trying to stop yourself and again asking that question, what am I saying to myself? Now, in the heat of a discussion like that, it's not always straightforward to stop. And so you might need to be able to do some reflection at a later point where you look back at the situation that you were facing and you think about what you were saying to yourself out loud, what you said out loud in the conversation, and also what it was that you were saying to yourself internally. Being able to do that and ask yourself, what was I saying to myself, might then produce a different outcome the next time. So that's catching yourself in the act of thinking. Then think about the category that your self-talk falls into, because being able to do so means that you might be able then to label your self-talk, which will then provide you with some emotional distance from the situation, which will help you calm your threat response, allowing you to be better able to cope. If you're a critic, you may tell yourself off. But it's important in these times to have some self-compassion, to be kind to yourself. You're already stressed. Cut yourself some slack. Allow yourself some freedom. Don't beat yourself up. As a victim, you can feel so powerless, but actually research has shown that when we question ourselves, saying, I've got a problem, what am I going to do about it? It begins to calm our threat response and reduces the levels of adrenaline and cortisol in our bodies. Here, it's worthwhile trying to think about those things that you can change rather than the things that you can't. Think about the things that you can change. And the perfectionist who says they're never good enough. Well, here, why don't you think about changing your expectation to something which is more realistic? This will have a dramatically calming effect upon your body and will reduce the levels of cortisol and adrenaline, which will mean that you're better able to cope with yourself. Then there's being able to manage your thoughts. Now, sometimes these are just our thoughts seem to be so unmanageable. And if that's the case, there are a few little tips that we might be able to use here. The first one is using day-tight compartments. Here, you'll be able to take your concern or your anxiety and put it into a compartment to be sealed and dealt with later. It's the same sort of thing as a ship that has bulkheads. If the hull is holed, the bulkheads are sealed so that the water is restricted from the rest of the boat. If they didn't, the whole ship would be sunk because the water would go to the rest of the hull. But with the bulkhead, it's able to contain the water into one section of the ship only. It doesn't cause the problem for the rest of the ship. In the same sort of way, we want the problem that we have, the anxiety that we've got, to go into a compartment, not to be ignored, but to be sealed, to be dealt with later. We don't want it to dominate the rest of our lives, the rest of our day, or indeed the rest of our night. So, for example, you might be having difficulty sleeping. You wake in the night and you're worrying. At that point, it's worthwhile then taking your thought, putting it into the daytime compartment and saying, I'm going to put it there and I'm going to deal with it at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. You'll be in a better position then to be able to return to sleep. Then there's distraction, using distraction as a tool to be able to help you calm yourself. Distraction is to think about something completely different. Just to change the thought, rather than focusing on the same thing all the time. Change your thought to something to gain, so that your focus is on something completely different. And then thankfulness. We regard thankfulness as the antidote to stress. It's very difficult to be thankful and anxious at the same time. But you might not always be feeling thankful. And in which case, I would suggest that you just start where you are, being simple and straightforward. Thank you that I can see. Thank you that I can see outside the blue sky. Thank you that I'm able to take exercise. Thank you for the roof over my head. Being thankful begins to change the way you think. And rather than responding out of your emotions, which usually leads to some form of destructive communication, we begin to engage our rational brain, which then enables us to be constructive in the things that we say. Let me encourage you to exercise thankfulness or gratitude so that you're able then to be communicating in a much more constructive way. Stress is something that we must live with, but so that we don't suffer its ill effects, let's practice these simple steps. Recognize your self-talk, its power, its potency, the fact that what's going on all the time. It's just useful to know what it is we're saying to ourselves. Catch yourself in the act of thinking. Think about what you're thinking about. Then capture your thoughts. Remember the category of your self-talk. Try and work out that and label it to give you some emotional distance. Then to distract yourself, to focus your attention on something completely different. And then be thankful. Thankful for what you've got, for who you are. Doing these things will help reduce your levels of adrenaline and cortisol, and will greatly improve your emotional health and well-being. Thanks so much for watching. At Rewire, we are a group of Christian life coaches, and we offer one-to-one sessions. We run seminars and training courses, both online and face-to-face. For more information, please take a look at our website, which is www.rewirelifecoaching.com. And should you wish to get in touch with us directly, please email us at info@rewirelifecoaching.com. Thank you.